We're
All right,
good?
we should be recording, yep.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Gabriella Garrison. I'm the coordinator for the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, and I'm also the Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So in just a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this organization, the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. But before we get to that, let's go over a few quick Zoom reminders, which I think most people are probably aware of all this after the last 13 months. But microphones and cameras have been turned off. We're going to have a Q&A session after all the presentations have ended. We've left a good amount of time in hopes that there will be lots of questions and discussion. So if you have a question during the presentations, type it in the Q&A box, and then we will try to address it at the end. If we don't get to it though, we're also going to have contact information for each speaker. So if you have additional questions, you can reach out to the speaker individually. The webinar is being recorded, and we're going to have it posted to our YouTube channel within a week. We'll send out a notification to let you know when it's up and running. So the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, we are a young partnership. We've only been meeting for about 3 years now, and we're a partnership of 27 agencies and organizations with interest in pollinator outreach and conservation across the state. And we're really quite a diverse representation of organizations, but we all have this one common interest of pollinator conservation in North Carolina. So this webinar in particular was brought to you, or is being brought to you, by the Outreach Committee. And as you can see here, we have 6 committees: plant resources, outreach, habitat assessment, research, energy, and pesticide stewardship. And in a little while, you'll be hearing about a project that our research committee organized that pertains to fire and bees specifically. So if you want to find out more about our organization, this is our website, ncpollinatoralliance.org, and we are also present on most social media platforms. We will also be hosting a webinar on May 25th, and it's going to talk specifically about mosquito management in conjunction with our pollinators, how to keep our pollinators safe and still manage for mosquitoes. So keep an eye on our website and social media. We'll have the invite posted for that pretty soon here. This is a list of our partners, so you can see the diversity. And I think we're so successful in what we do just because we have so many different voices, and that helps with our efforts to conserve across the state. So let's talk about what we're going to look at today. We're going to jump right in and talk about how does fire impact bees, the question of the hour. Then we're going to do a little deeper dive into bee biology and a study that was conducted on the Wallflower Moss Foundation in Moore County. That was about 8 or 9 years ago. And then we're going to wrap up with talking about an ongoing study that's happening right now on game lands across the state. So our speakers are Dr. Clyde Sorensen from the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology, and then Dr. Elsa Youngstadt from the Department of Applied Ecology, and then myself. I'm going to wrap it up. And then special thanks to Tara Moore from the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, who's going to be monitoring our Q&A and helping us with questions at the end. So I'm going to hand things over to Clyde, and while he's getting his screen set up, Elsa has a poll for us. Let me stop sharing.
All right, and I just launched the poll while Clyde's getting set up. If you can weigh in, we'd just like to know a little bit more about who's actually joining us today and get a sense of like what your interest is in bees and fire. And I still see answers rolling in, so I'll leave it up for a few more seconds before I end it. All right, that seems like it's stabilized. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling.
All right.
And turn it over to Clyde. Clyde, are you able to see the results?
Yeah, I've got it right here. And it looks like about almost half of the folks are biologists, about 29% land managers, 9% are gardeners. And then we have some beekeepers and some land managers and some others. But about half the folks are biologists.
Thanks,
Very
everyone.
good. So I guess I can get going. If I can find my little arrow to close the poll out so that I'm not staring at it the entire time. All right, so my task in this presentation is to try and give you all some background on what we know from previous research to be the relationship between bees and fire. And so I'm going to cover several different points that address the different ways that fire might impact bees. And when we talk about the research that's been done prior to what we're going to be presenting a little bit later today, we need to understand that most of what we know about bees and fire comes from studies that involve wildfire. And of course, because they involve wildfire, they're kind of, a lot of times they're kind of ad hoc after the fact, because, you know, it's not really ethical to go out like massive wildfires so you can do research on the aftermath. And it's important to recognize that, you know, wildfires, particularly the Western wildfires that a lot of this research is based on, are quite different from the kinds of fires that we deliberately employ on landscapes in, say, longleaf pine forests. And, you know, one of the big differences is that wildfires, particularly those Western wildfires, tend to be very intense and consume a lot more of what biomass there is there. They tend to cover large units of land. And because of the intensity and the scale of a lot of these wildfires, the scale of biodiversity, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, is quite different. And in a lot of cases, those landscapes tend to be a lot more homogeneous after the fire than a lot of our landscapes are after the low intensity managed fires we employ deliberately. There are relatively few studies that have been done on the effects of managed fire. We're going to talk about a couple of those in a minute, and even fewer that have been done in longleaf pine ecosystems, which I think are probably what a lot of y'all care about a great deal. So this is what we call a meta analysis of fire effect studies on pollinators by Carbone and his colleagues that came out in 2019. And so this synthesized about, I don't know, 60 or 70 different studies. And they did some meta-analysis on the statistics from those studies and determined that to some extent anyway, fire is a pretty good thing for some categories of pollinators. And these graphs, by the way, don't worry too much about what a hedges is, but basically if the parameter is greater than 0, it's a positive effect on that category. And if it's lower than 0, it's a negative effect. And when they looked at all fire, and that includes the fires that were deliberately set and managed scenarios and studies in that kind of situation, when they looked at all fire, well, it looks like fire is at least marginally positive for Hymenoptera. Is probably not all that great for Lepidoptera. For Coleoptera, it may be positive in terms of abundance of pollinators. And then in terms of richness, and richness, of course, is the diversity. How many different kinds of pollinators of that category are there? It may be marginally positive in that respect for Hymenoptera and perhaps negative for Lepidoptera. When they look just at wildfire, then the positive effect on Hymenoptera in terms of richness and in terms of abundance seem to be a little bit more clear cut. So in this case, they were excluding managed fire. And the problem with that is that, one, there aren't a lot of studies in managed fire systems, and two, a lot of the fire that they were looking at in those managed systems were systems that are quite structurally different from longleaf pine forests. So this kind of overarching meta-analysis says that fire is probably a good thing for lots of different kinds of pollinators. But we're going to look more directly at how fire might impact hymenopteran pollinators, because hymenoptera are in most systems the most important in terms of diversity and oftentimes in terms of actual sheer numbers, the most important pollinators. And so there are several different ways fire can influence bees in particular. And one of these is that can basically burn them up. You can have a loss of insect biomass after a fire. It can change the availability of nesting habitat for those bees that nest above ground in woody woody debris or in canes and things like that. It can have influences on floral resources. We'll talk about that for bees after a fire. And it could have an impact on the availability of nesting substrates and sites for ground nesting bees. So we'll look at each one of these a little bit closer, but very briefly. So in terms of insect biomass response to fire, there has been some work done on this. And in general, it looks like some groups of insects are negatively affected, at least temporarily, by fire, by just the fact that they're consumed by the fire and unable to get out of the way of it. This is really noticeable with Orthoptera, with grasshoppers and crickets. There's also some evidence that in some systems, parasitic Hymenoptera, which some of them may be pollinators, most of them probably aren't really important pollinators, may decline, partly in response to a decline in host base. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for direct mortality to bees or direct loss of biomass of bees. And we can talk more about that maybe later if that brings a question to your mind. So in general, we don't think that there's a lot of negative consequence of fire to bees, and for that matter, probably some of the other pollinators as well. So what about changing nesting habitat for wood-dwelling bees? And Elsa's going to get into this more in just a few minutes, but about 3/4 of the bees that we're concerned about are ground nesters, and about 1/4 of them nest above the ground, and that's usually in either wood or in the hollow canes of herbaceous plants and things like that. And of course, when you run a fire through a piece of landscape, that stuff, a lot of that stuff gets changed, sometimes for the good, sometimes not so good. And so, not surprisingly, the evidence is kind of conflicting. In at least one study that we found, it does look like fire at least temporarily reduces habitat for those bees that nest above ground. So in this graph, the gray dots are bees that nest above ground, and the black dots are bees that nest below ground. And what this is showing is that shortly after a fire, at least in this study, the habitat for those above ground nesting bees, those wood dwelling bees, did decline. And so there was a concomitant decline in those bees. But then after a while, that recovers. And so that's an interesting observation in itself. And that may reflect changes actually in the actual composition of the bees that are using that landscape too. In another study, though, there was evidence that fire actually increases habitat by increasing dead wood that some bees can use. And so this was a study that was done in Europe. And here they saw a positive relationship in one system to fire, in that Xylocopus, the carpenter bees, and Serratinia bees both increased because there was the fire killed woody plants, and those woody plants then provided habitat for those bees to nest in. In this same study, though, and in a Mediterranean system where the fire is much more severe, they saw a loss of habitat for bees that dwell above ground. And so again, we're not real sure exactly what to say about it, but except that some bees probably suffer and some bees probably benefit, those above ground bees. Now, there's a lot of work been given over to trying to understand what the impact of fire is on floral resources. And in a lot of studies, there's been a demonstrated positive response of bees to fire post burn. And in a lot of those studies, they attribute that increase to the increase in floral resources. And so we've got two different studies here. This study on the right, this Galbraith study, was looking at wildfire in this particular case, and this is Western wildfire, so intense wildfire, but on a scale of intensity of the wildfire. So this parameter on the bottom is just don't worry about what the units are, but it's basically a measure of how intense a wildfire is, how completely combustion occurs and whatnot. And in this study, they found in 2 years that the more intense the wildfire was post-burn, the more positively bees and flower resources responded. And that probably has to do with the more intense a wildfire is, the more the tree canopy is destroyed, the more sunlight reaches the ground, and the more herbaceous plants that bees rely on increase. In this study on the left, this study by Campbell et al., they were working in a hardwood system in the Appalachians. So it's not exactly congruent with what we were working in longleaf. And in this study, they had a control where they did no management, a mechanical treatment where they mechanically thinned the canopy, and then a burn treatment where they burned to reduce the canopy to some extent, and also to manipulate the ground cover, and then a combination of the mechanical treatment and the burn treatment. And bear in mind, this is in a closed canopy, hardwood, Southern Appalachian kind of forest system. And in this case, they had a positive response in the bees to the burn and to the combination of the mechanical and the burn. And the strongest response was in the combination, which probably reflects that combination of a mechanical treatment and a burn treatment decreased the tree canopy the greatest and allowed more sunlight to reach the soil. The burn treatment and the mechanical treatment differ because the mechanical treatment, after they go in and thin the trees, there's still a lot of debris left on the ground that shades the ground and reduces the emergence of floral resources. So a lot of studies, bottom line, a lot of studies show after a fire or after some other kind of canopy thinning experience, floral resources increase and then bees increase. And so we can say fairly confidently that fire is good for flowers that bees like to use. And so it's probably good for bees in that respect. Now, it's a little less clear exactly what goes on in terms of increasing suitable nesting habitat for ground nesting bees. A lot of ground nesting bees, as Elsa will probably address momentarily, a lot of ground nesting bees like open ground. They don't like to wade through vegetation to get to the soil surface and then excavate their nests. And so fire reduces ground cover. And so you might expect fire to be positive in that respect for ground nesting bees. So some folks have looked at what possible effects fire might have on ground nesting bees. And in this study by Kane and Neff in 2011, they did a lot of work to try and establish exactly how deep into the soil profile the effects of the heat effects of fire might penetrate. And the bottom line was, if bees are lower than about 5 centimeters into the soil profile, they're probably not going to cook. They're safe, at least from the heat effects of fire. And this graph here shows that a preponderance of the species of bees that nest in the ground excavate deeper than 5 centimeters. 5 centimeters is 2 inches. So that's not very far, right? It's not a very, trying to put it, there's my camera. It's not very far. And most bees that nest in the ground probably go deeper than that. So What that means is that a fire passing over a bee nest probably has very little effect on that bee nest. More importantly, a fire passing over a ground that bees might want to inhabit takes out the leaf litter, takes out the herbaceous vegetation. It exposes that ground surface and perhaps makes it more desirable for ground nesting bees. And I think Elsa may have a little bit to add to that when she talks. And so, of course, we see more bare ground after wildfire. We see more bare ground after prescribed fire. But because prescribed fire is generally much lower in intensity, the effects are probably not as dramatic as they are with really intense wildfires in terms of reducing soil cover, or things that cover the soil on the ground surface. All right, so we've been really interested in longleaf pine ecosystems and bees, and I kind of suspect most of you already know that because a longleaf system is basically a forest on a grassland, they're really good habitat for bees. They're sunny. There's lots of herbaceous vegetation, lots of different kinds of potential floral resources on the floor of a longleaf forest. They're great bee habitat. And about 75% of the flowering plants that are in longleaf systems are thought to be reliant on insect pollination. And so bees are probably real important to longleaf systems. And we know, and Elsa's going to tell you more about this in a moment, but we know that bees are really diverse in longleaf systems, and that a lot of different bee species occur in these kinds of landscapes. And of those bees that we find in longleaf systems, about, again, 75% are ground nesters. All right, so I'm probably running close to out of time. I really only have one more thing I want to address after I talk a little bit about this study that was done in a pine savanna system. Ulishin and his colleagues did do some work on a system that's similar to a longleaf system. Actually, as it turns out, the pines in their system are shortleaf and loblolly, but they still had a pretty rigorous burn management system. And in this study, they used emergence traps to compare 3 different burn treatments: an annual burn, a biennial burn, and every 3-year burn, against control where there wasn't burning. And using emergence traps, which are basically cages that you set on the ground, pinned to the ground over patches of potential bee habitat, with a little jar at the top that collects them when they come up. They found that burning benefited ground nesting bees compared to an unburned check. And this is a graph from their study that shows that bees were most abundant in the 1-year burn frequency and least abundant in the unburned control. The richness, the number of species, was again greater in the short burn intervals compared to the control. The evenness, which is a measure of how abundant they are one relative to the others, was not as dramatic, but was lower in the most frequently burned. And that's an interesting question that we might could get into a little bit later. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is pyrodiversity. And pyrodiversity is an important feature of burn landscapes. And again, when we talk about pyrodiversity, we mean this patch of ground was burned more or less intensively, or more recently or longer ago than this other patch of ground. And how big that patch of ground is relative to other patches that were burned in a different intensity and a different timeline, that complexity is what we're talking about when we talk about pyrodiversity. And as it turns out, pyrodiversity is a good thing, it seems like, for pollinator community function. In other words, the more pyrodiversity you have on a landscape, the more robust that pollinator community is likely to be, and the more effective it is. And in some cases, perhaps more persistent it's likely to be. Pyrodiversity also promotes generalization. So that means lots of plants that can use lots of pollinators, and lots of pollinators that can use lots of plants. Another important thing to think about when we think about biodiversity is that, particularly for insects, scale is really critical. Most insects can fly as adults, but their ability to fly varies. Some insects can fly miles, but other insects can only fly yards. And so the scale of biodiversity has a big impact on the retention of rare species of plants, of course, but also of pollinators, and for that matter, for herbivores. And what I'm getting to is, if burn units are too large and burn too uniformly, we may actually make things very difficult for some of the insects and some of the plants that those insects rely on to persist in the landscape. And the good thing is that, a lot of the kinds of fire that we're talking about, low intensity prescribed fire, especially if we can deploy that fire in smaller burn blocks, is going to foster biodiversity that might be really beneficial to insect pollinators and to lots of other little bitty charismatic creatures that live in our landscapes. All right, so to wrap my chunk up, it looks like in general, bees, and particularly ground nesting bees, respond very positively to fire. Fire is actually necessary for the persistence, I think, of some of those bees. It's less clear what happens with those that live above ground, but could be good, could be bad, could depend on what kind of bee you're talking about. And then again, just to reiterate, that biodiversity is really quite desirable in terms of what we're talking about with pollinators and insects. And as always, we need more research. So with that, I'll wrap my piece up and turn it over to Elsa, and we'll look forward to visiting with you later on.
All right, thanks, Clyde. That was great. And sorry, that just came out sounding disingenuous. I mean it. It's distracted because I'm like figuring out how to share my screen. Anyway, I think, can you all see my screen now? Somebody who's on camera, give me a thumbs up. All right. So welcome again. And in my section, I want to pick up where Clyde left off and bring some of this home to North Carolina specific habitats. And I'm going to share a study that we did specifically in longleaf pine ecosystem in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. But since we are talking North Carolina now, I want to give you a super brief primer on bees of North Carolina, which is a tiny sample of our diversity is represented on this slide. And our current checklist is actually up to 560 species statewide. And obviously there's a huge range of diversity. Just about every size, color, and shape you could think of is represented, but there are a few things that all of those species have in common. Some kind of shared steps in their life cycle. And I need to move my little Zoom bar out of the way. This always happens. All right, so I want to run quickly through that life cycle since we're going to be thinking about how it meshes with So usually when we see bees, they're out here, we see adult bees foraging on flowers, but that's actually a tiny share of their life cycle. Often who we see foraging are female bees who are collecting nectar and pollen as resources to take back to their nest, such as this one. This is an example of a bee nesting in above ground woody debris. And they'll stock that nest full of nectar and pollen, lay an egg on it. The egg will hatch into a larva who eats the nectar and pollen, will pupate, go through this transitional phase, and eventually emerge as a new adult bee. This whole process can take anywhere from a few weeks to about a year. And so even though there's a lot of variation across species in how that life cycle actually plays out, there are two basic requirements for bees, period. One of them is food, in the form of lots of nectar and pollen that they use to fuel their own activities and to feed their larvae, and then shelter, these nesting sites that Clyde also referred to. And what counts as shelter depends on the species. So of our 560 species in the state, about 76%, just over 3/4, nest in the ground. They dig tunnels into the soil And that's where they, stash their pollen, lay their eggs. Another 3% are this kind of catch-all cavity nester category. So these are mostly bumblebees, and they nest sometimes above ground, sometimes below ground. You'll find them in things like birdhouses, wall voids, rodent burrows. And so those are cavity nesters. They're a little bit hard to pigeonhole, to mix metaphors. And then the last 21% are our above ground wood and stem nesters. So you'll find them in things like hollow stems of perennials or twigs, broken off twigs that have revealed the pith inside. They'll hollow those out, or they'll use old beetle burrows that were previously drilled by beetles in dead wood. And then of course there are carpenter bees, like the two species that insist on drilling their own holes in sound dead wood, but everybody else is reusing previously drilled holes. So given that life cycle and those food and shelter requirements, we can see that fire might present some trade-offs. You might have situations like on the left where the fire is burning up the nesting resources and potentially bees inside it for that 20% that are nesting above ground. But there might be, that might be counterbalanced by this flush of floral resources that you get once there's more light getting down to the ground and encouraging this flowering vegetation. And so these potential trade-offs led to the research questions that we wanted to address in this study that I'm going to show you. First of all, how does fire, specifically managed fire in this longleaf pine ecosystem, affect resource availability for bees? And then how does that affect the abundance and diversity of bees in the year or 2 or 3 following a fire? And then finally, do we see differences in how above ground and below ground nesting bees might respond? And before I get into the research itself, I need to acknowledge Heather Moylette, who's the person who actually collected the data that I'm going to show you. She did this as part of her master's research in 2012-2013. It is still news. We just published it last year because that's how life and science work sometimes. And in fact, this is the paper that, if you want like the nitty-gritty non-10-minute version of the story I'm going to tell you, this is where to find it. And then I also need to acknowledge the Wellflower Moss Foundation, which is the location of the study and partly funded the work as well. And the Moss Foundation is located in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. If you know the local landmarks, it's just east of the town of Southern Pines, just north of Fort Bragg. And the vast majority, around 90% or more of that land, is managed with prescribed fire. And at the time of this study, that meant dormant season burns on a 3-year rotation. And we'll come back to the dormant versus growing season question at the end. And so for the study, Heather selected 16 different sites. The 4 that you can see here, these blue triangles, are all the unburned controls. So there is a small percent of the property that hasn't seen fire in at least 50 years, and that's where these control sites were located. And then there were 4 sites, my mouse is jumping ahead on me. There were 4 sites that had been burned just the year of the study. Since it was dormant season burns, they were burned from January to April, and then the study started that spring, so just months later. And then the last 8 sites were either 1 year out from the burn or 2 years out from the burn. And of course, the study went on for 2 years, so all of those burn sites swapped categories between years. And we, of course, took that into account in everything I'm going to show you, but there were these 16 sites altogether. And our first question was how fire actually affects the resources for bees in these habitats. And first, I'm going to give you just the impression, which for many of you who do work with fire already, this will be a very familiar chronosequence. This is an unburned control. You can see it's very full of an oak mid-story. The ground is covered in leaf litter. This is a lovely freshly burned pine savanna in the months following the fire. And then as you move, a year or 2 after fire, that mid-story starts to fill in a little bit, but it's obviously still much more open than an unburned control. So everything you can tell by sort of eyeballing those sites also turns out to be true when you measure them. So for this section, I'm mainly going to compare for you control versus freshly burned sites. And in most cases, the 1 year and 2 year sites were intermediate between those two. When that's not the case, I'll mention it. But so canopy cover was 23% less in a freshly burned site than a control site. So what you can obviously see, and yes, we are getting more sun down on the ground, we're getting warmer, drier habitats that right there are already going to start to encourage bee activity. Floral diversity was 3.4 times higher at the freshly burned sites than the controls, and floral abundance was 2.6 times more. Interestingly, floral abundance continued to increase through the burn cycle. It was always better at burn sites than control sites, but 1 or 2 years later was even better than a freshly burned site in this study. Bare ground went from 0% to 36% of the ground being bare soil accessible to ground nesting bees. And woody debris, interestingly, didn't change in quantity. It did vary among sites, but not relative to whether they had been burned or when they had been burned. So that's what the habitat was doing. Did the bees actually respond in kind? To find out, Heather sampled the sites with bee bowls, also known as pan traps. That's what's shown in these pictures. There's little colored dishes filled with soapy water. Bees fall in, drown. It's a mean trick, but it's a way of very consistently sampling across sites. And so she had 15 traps per site and then repeated the trapping 23 times over the 2 years at all of the sites. And then of course, identified all of the bees. And altogether, her sample included over 2,000 individual bees representing 109 species. So almost a fifth of the bee diversity in North Carolina fell into her bowls in those 16 sites. And of those species, 66% of them were exclusive to burned sites. And only 5% were found in the control sites alone. The rest were shared between sites. So even though the control sites were 25% of the total sampling effort, only 5% of the bees were unique to those sites. And that pattern kind of also carries out in these graphs where you can see that the abundance on the y-axis, the number of bees that fell into the traps at a given site on a given day, they were 2.3 times more abundant in the freshly burned sites than controls, and then the in-between years were intermediate. And diversity showed a similar pattern with more than double the number of bee species per collecting event in fresh burns than in controls. Of course, diversity can depend on abundance. When you catch more bees, you can detect more kinds of bees. And when we control for abundance and just say how many species per 50 bees, the sites don't actually differ. So the real benefit of the fire is increasing just the overall carrying capacity of the landscape. You can support more bees in it and therefore larger populations of more kinds of bees. And then finally, this question of above ground versus below ground nesting. We thought these ground nesters would benefit based on all of the prior research that Clyde mentioned. And sure enough, if you look on a per species basis, ground nesting bees tended to be more than twice as abundant in any of the burn sites than in the control sites. We were a little worried about these above ground nesters, that they might be getting, they or their nesting materials might be getting burned up, but in fact, there was no difference in abundance of above ground nesters, regardless of the burn treatment, which is kind of consistent with what we saw, that the amount of woody debris also didn't change. So it seems like these fires are great for ground nesters and not catastrophic for above ground nesters. So to recap, the burn sites clearly supported much higher bee density of individuals and density of species. That was mainly due to an increase in the abundance and diversity of ground nesting bees, but at least we didn't lose above ground nesters. Interestingly, bee abundance and diversity peaked in the year of the burn, like in the months following that burn, whereas floral abundance peaked in the 2 years post-burn. So the bees and the flowers are not responding in the exact same way, and those differences may actually be because that access to bare ground is greatest in the first year. So it may be that nesting resources are driving this pattern even more than floral resources. And of course, there are some lingering unknowns. One of the same ones that Clyde mentioned, this question of what is the ideal burn block size? That's something I would personally love to know, how bees are moving through this landscape and using it as a mosaic and commuting between different burn patches to complete their life cycles. It's also worth acknowledging that bee bowls do catch just a subset of bees. So it would be great to see these patterns play out with multiple sampling methods where you're getting an even broader slice of the community. And also, like I mentioned, these were all dormant season burns, which obviously catch bees at a very different point in their life cycle than a growing season burn. but a lot of land managers, including the Moss Foundation now, have moved to growing season burns because it's more representative of the historical or prehistoric burn cycles in this region. So that's also an area that needs to be revisited at some point, looking at growing season burns in our region. And so that is my ending point, and I'm ready to hand it off to Gabriella to take it from there.
Okay, can you see my screen? Excellent. Well, I'm going to wrap up this discussion and talk about a project that is currently happening right now on game lands across the state. And let me just talk briefly about the purpose. We wanted to know what kind of diversity we had on game lands in the state. There's been discussions for a long time of insect decline, and not really knowing what our baseline was problematic. So we wanted to get onto the landscape, especially on the lands that we manage, the Wildlife Resources Commission, and see what we had. And so then the next question is the question of prescribed fire, because that is how we manage primarily, especially in the sandhills. And so with that information, that helps us make more informed land management decisions, especially as we're seeing declines in insects and bees particularly. So we have this map, and Elsa actually put this together for us, of historic records. And the black spots, the black halos here, are where the most concentrated records occurred. So when we were choosing spots where we wanted to find out some of the diversity, this is the guidance that we used. And so we ended up picking spots that were here in the Piedmont, and then obviously down here in the Sandhills, and then over here in the mountains was one of our sampling areas. And then our first year, we were looking at Holly Shelter down here, but our second year, we ended up switching to Neuse River Game Lands, which was up here. So less records, but Croatan National Forest is right here. And I think there are quite a few records there as well. So a little bit of background before I jump in too much deeper. This project was organized through the Pollinator Conservation Alliance Research Committee. And we started talking about this in 2019. So that's what we're calling our pilot year. It was early in the spring. It was maybe February. So I guess it was more late in the winter. And we started discussing how we could work this out. And being that I'm a commission employee, the game lands was the most obvious place to start, just because we had access, and access can be an issue for sure. And so we were a little late because of some technical issues and logistical issues in our sampling. So we didn't start until June, unfortunately, that year. And so we missed some of the early spring bees that are out in April and May. So our first complete year was actually last year, 2020. We were out at the very beginning of April. And Sandy Mush Game Land is our mountains game land. Butner Falls of Neuse is our Piedmont game land. Sandhill game land, obviously in the Sandhills. And our first complete year, we switched from Holly Shelter to the Neuse River game land, because on Holly Shelter, they primarily burn every 2 years. And we really wanted to look at distribution across 3 years. And on Neuse River game lands, we were able to find that. And the habitat and the vegetation was very similar to Holly Shelter. So that's why we made that jump. So some initial thoughts before I start talking about the study. Is there a difference between 2 and 3 year burn intervals? I think that's a pretty common question. And so that's what we were hoping to find with some of the sites that we were sampling. How does burn block size influence response? I think that's a pretty common thread between all of our presentations today. And like Elsa said, it's still sort of an unknown. We don't really know what the magical number is. There are a few studies that investigate how land use management practices shape bee communities. So with doing this study, we were hoping to get a little more insight into how we should be managing our land to promote pollinator diversity and abundance. And then this is just more a comment than a question. As time progresses, more bees are likely to get federally listed. So knowing what we have on our landscape is going to be very important. Oops, wrong way. All right, a few considerations. What are the available resources in terms of personnel and equipment for habitat management? And when I'm talking habitat management, I'm specifically talking about burning, because you need equipment on site. You need a certain amount of personnel on site. And so if you only have 2 or 3 people for a burn, it's going to obviously affect the size and the location potentially, the time of year that you burn. So the resources is pretty important to consider when you're burning and when you're managing habitat. So ideally in the commission, we're managing for overall ecosystem health, right? But in some areas, we are managing for certain species. And I mean particularly rare or threatened and endangered species, a lot of different herps. And that comes into play with growing and dormant season burns as well. And then we're also managing for certain habitat types. So there's really a range of things that we're looking at, but knowing that we're doing it that way, it's positive because it means that we can incorporate other aspects of pollinator management into what we're doing. So on average, we burn about 35 to 40,000 acres a year, with the exception of last year, which was about 30% less because of pandemic related issues and not being able to get out to certain areas. And so we have this marker that we try to hit every year because burning is so important. And like I said, this is the main way that we manage habitat. And so we want to make sure to try to hit that marker every year. And sometimes that drives the 2-year burns versus the 3-year burns. And then lastly, fire managers, they face challenges. So, you know, just because they have the tools and the personnel to burn doesn't mean that they can burn anywhere. You know, they have to consider things like residential areas in proximity, other structures, commercial areas. They have to consider time of year. In some parts of the state, they have green up much earlier than in other parts of the state. For instance, in the Piedmont, a lot of their burning usually wraps up in April. Whereas in the Sandhills, that's really when we're getting going in April and May and June. They have to consider smoke issues. They have to consider weather issues. So there's a lot of different components that fire managers have to think about before they get out on site and put fire on the ground. So our methodology, it's going to be pretty similar to what Elsa was describing. We chose 3 sites per game land. One site was in an area that was just recently burned. Ideally, we were choosing growing season burn areas, but we didn't always get that. In some areas, we had to go with a burn that was in February or March, so not quite growing season. But again, you can't necessarily dictate the fire. You have to let the fire dictate you. Our second area was a site that had been burned in 2019 and then a 2018 burn. So we were trying to get some diversity across the sites, and that definitely changed the vegetation as well. And like I said, the 2019 sampling, it didn't start until June. So bees that emerged in the spring were missed. So we're considering that an incomplete data set. So 2020 was really our first full year, and we're working through a burn rotation. So this study will last 3 years. So first year was last year, 2020. 2021, we just started our second year at the beginning of April, and then next year will be our last year, and that will get us data throughout a 3-year burn cycle. All right, so we used bee bowls like Elsa used, and we put soapy water in them. And this image above, this gives you a general idea of what the transects look like. We had 30 bowls per site. And I think I mentioned this before, but in total, we had 12 sites across the state, right? 3 sites at each game land and 4 game lands total. And each bowl was separated by 5 meters. And, you know, this pattern right here, it wasn't necessarily the exact pattern, but the idea is to get some diversity in colors across the transects. So every 2 weeks, we were out between April and October. We put out 30 bowls in the morning and we left them out all day. And then we picked them up late that afternoon and we stored the specimens in ethanol and whirl packs. And then while those bee bowls were sitting out collecting bees, we were netting at all of the sites. And so a lot of bees will go into the bee bowls. And I love how Elsa describes there are certain species of bees that will almost throw themselves into the bowls. But there are other species of bees that won't go near the bowls. And so that's why we added in the netting component. So we could really try to get a good reach of all the diversity that was at the site. Because certainly there were bees that we were netting that wouldn't touch the bowls. And so we had 2 sessions. We had a morning session between 10 and 1. And we hit all 3 of those sites in the morning. And then we went back in the afternoon and netted at all of those sites again. So we were netting for 30 minutes at each site in the morning and then 30 minutes in the afternoon. And that gave us a pretty good range of netting at all of the sites. And so this is our data sheet right here, pretty standard data sheet. We were recording location, we were recording time, weather, we were recording what flower we caught the bee on. And then for some species like bumblebees that we're seeing a lot of decline, if we're able to, we are photo recording those species to try to minimize the impact to those declining populations. And then this is an example of one of the vials that we use to store the bees. This is our data sheet, or this is actually the database. And you can see, like I just mentioned, all of the information that we're gathering at each of these sites, specific location, counties, the date that it was collected, the flower, so on and so forth. So being that we're just right in the middle of this study, there's not too much data that we're able to share at this point, but this is some data from 2019, and it just gives you an idea of some of the things that we are seeing, how many bees we were collecting, for instance, 987 at the Sandhills, 799 in the Piedmont, and then an idea of the number of species that we were seeing at each site. And so this shows some of the diversity. Halictids are sweat bees. And you can see that that captured most of the specimens that we were seeing. However, again, remember for 2019, we missed the first 2 months of the season, so we don't know what we missed. And so with 2020, we're in the process of identifying those specimens. So I think that's certainly going to increase the diversity that we were finding. All right, so this shows what sites the bees were most abundant at. And so in the Sandhills and the coastal plain, the bees were most abundant at the most recently burned site, which I think is what we're seeing across all the other studies like Clyde was talking about and Elsa was talking about. At the Piedmont, interestingly, the bees were more equally distributed among sites. And in the next slide, you're also going to see that there were some wonky things happening in the Piedmont. But again, just remember, this is one snapshot in time. This is 2019. And so we're not really going to be able to piece things together until we have the whole data set and we can look across everything. So this was showing diversity, most species. And again, at the Sandhills and coastal plain sites, most species were detected at the more recently or the most recently burned site as expected. At the Piedmont, kind of the strange outlier, more species were detected at the oldest burned site. So not really sure what's going on there, but this was 2019. We're really excited to see what 2020, 21, and 22 are gonna look like when we have all of the results compiled together. So just a few notes of things that we saw in 2019 that we thought would be interesting to share. So there's this one species, this ground nesting solitary bee, that is very uncommon, and there are a few state records for it. And it was netted at the Sandhills Game Land during the 2019 field season. And so according to very noted bee expert Sam Droege, its presence is an indication of a healthy landscape. So on the one hand, that's really great because that must mean that we're doing something right. But conversely, if you think about it, if we only found one, does that mean that there should be more on the landscape and we're doing something wrong? So I'd like to think about it more positively, that we're doing something right, because we burn most of our sites on Sandhills Game Land every 2 to 3 years. But we really have to start thinking about some of those things that Clyde and Elsa were talking about, you know, as far as having a very checkerboarded kind of landscape, not burning, 1,000 acres all in one season. We want to have small areas burned and then the areas around it be available refugia type habitat. So I think, and then not have every site burned consistently every 2 years, or not have every site consistently burned every 3 years, because in a more historical setting, it would have been more variable. One site may have been burned every 2 years, but then it may have gone back to 3 years, just depending on the lightning strikes and other circumstances. So trying to recreate that historical setting, I think, is really important for us to consider when we're thinking about insects and pollinators in particular. So another interesting note, this was also at Sandhills in 2019. There was this one species, these are wool carder bees, and they were found at all 3 sites during 2019. But what's interesting is that at other sites, non-WRC sites across the state relating to other projects, when these species were found, they were always found in conjunction with an invasive counterpart of this genus. So it was another Anthidium, another wool carder species. They were always found together, the non-native and the native version. But on the Sandhills sites, we only ever found the native versions. So again, hopefully that means we're doing something right, but it was just something interesting of note. And then lastly, in the Piedmont, also 2019 site, at the most recently burned site, there was this bumblebee species found, a very uncommon species, also declining. So it was pretty cool to find this bee out there. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up with a series of pictures because I think a lot of folks don't understand or don't see the diversity of bees. And I think a lot of folks actually think that honeybees and native bees are the same thing. And they don't realize the various sizes and colors and shapes that native bees represent. So this is a sweat bee, and I think a lot of folks associate green metallic bees with sweat bees, but this is also a sweat bee. So quite a bit smaller, quite a bit different color. This is a leaf cutter bee, and they are different than sweat bees in that, for instance, they have their pollen collecting hairs on their abdomen, whereas sweat bees have pollen collecting hairs on their legs. Here's another picture of a different species of leaf cutting bee, so quite a bit different looking than that first picture. This is a queen common eastern bumblebee, and you can see the magnitude of her size in relation to that flower. Oftentimes when you see them in the woods and they're nectaring on a flower, the flower's almost bending over because they're so heavy, and they're like little helicopters flying around, so they're pretty impressive. This is a carpenter bee, everybody's favorite, but you can see this guy is covered in pollen, which is pretty cool because, you know, some people don't like carpenter bees because they put holes in their decks and whatnot, but I like to think that they're pretty good pollinators. And then here's another image of a carpenter bee, just because I like how this shows that this is a male carpenter bee. He's got this whitish yellowish patch on his head. And so if you ever see a carpenter bee and it comes buzzing up into your face, which they tend to do, they're pretty harmless, and especially the males can't sting. If you see this patch right here, then you know you're looking at a male carpenter bee. So this is also a type of carpenter bee. This is a small carpenter bee in a different genus, but carpenter bee nonetheless, so you can see the difference. This is a sunflower bee. You can see they have these very hairy back legs. That's where they collect pollen. And then this is a longhorn bee. Also, you can see where they collect pollen right there. Large bulk of pollen. So with that, I think we're going to go to questions. And actually, I'm going to go ahead while we're answering questions. I'm going to put up our contact information slides so that if y'all have any questions for any of us, please reach out. We'd be glad to answer any and everything.
Great. This was wonderful. Thank you so much to the three of you. I'm sure we all learned a ton. I definitely did. So we have some good questions in the chat. We had one question that I think was answered about the amount of time after a fire and the observations being made. So if you have another question, Margit, please feel free to put that back in the chat. But I think we covered that one. We have a question from Brian about what effect does ash have on bees' ability to function in general? So any of you may answer that one.
I don't know. Does anybody?
That's a good question.
My guess is it's a really transient effect. It probably doesn't last any longer, if there is any effect, any longer than the first rainfall that you know, blast that ash back down. But now in a western wildfire situation where you may have a really thick bed of ash, that might have a bigger effect. But I don't think ash has much of an effect on bee behavior in a prescribed burn situation, I wouldn't think. But I don't know. I don't know that for sure.
Lock it up to the unknown category.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like,
That may be a future research question, right? Yeah, exactly.
I would say it's probably something that they've always evolutionarily dealt with. Those bees that inhabit, you know, fire-prone landscapes, they probably always dealt with it. So it probably something that it's not novel to them for sure, evolutionarily.
That makes sense. James was wondering what would be considered small burn blocks, less than 100 acres or smaller?
yeah, I think it's a fairly hand-wavy, mushy answer. Like I would say, like at the Moss Foundation, in that study, the burn blocks were like 18 to 20 hectares, or about 50 acres each, and that's a pretty small patchwork. But that's one of the big unknowns that I would love to know from the bees' perspective, like what counts as close and what counts as far. And it depends
Yeah.
on the size of the bee in most settings. Like there are little bees who will only fly like maybe a city block in their lifetime. I mean, they'll fly back and forth that city block 100 times, but they don't really go farther from their nest than that. And then there's things like carpenter bees and bumblebees who are capable of going for miles if they need to.
Mhm.
The answer is
Yeah.
probably different across species, but I think less than 100 acres probably counts as smallish in most burn.
And that's certainly one of the things that is going to be hard to address for certain land managers because, so Jamie, I think that was your question. Jamie works for the parks and I think you guys are able to burn smaller blocks, but I know for some of our game lands, we're not able to burn blocks that are less than 200 acres. Just realistically trying to get all the acreage accomplished that we need to, it can be a challenge, or we don't have enough personnel to do 2 block burns, maybe where we have 100 acre and 1 200 acre. So, questions like that would be really valuable for us to know if there was a threshold, because then maybe we could start incorporate that into management plans potentially.
I think that's going to be of course, it's going to be a very expensive question to answer. It's going to take a kind of unique situation to be able to answer that. But I would say 200 is better than 1,000. 200 is probably better than 500.
Yeah.
And it gets another question that was coming up is the shape of the burn block, and that has a big bearing on it. If it's a long linear block, then it probably can be bigger if it's longer and linear because you've got sources of movement from the long sides. But that'll have a bearing on exactly how big an area would be a small block and how much would be maybe excessive for some of the bees.
I think there is some ongoing research that may get to an answer before we do from that Tall Timbers group that I've seen presented at meetings, and it's not published yet, but I remember them describing like looking at different size burn blocks and finding that their biggest ones did have a delay in bees infiltrating back to the center of it. But of course, my notes from the meeting don't tell me like the size of those burn blocks, but I guess keep an eye, like set up a Google alert for it or something. Maybe when that paper comes out, we will be enlightened.
And I think there's some evidence from like the Western wildflower scenario where that same kind of thing happens, where the further away you get from source populations, the slower recolonization is.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think this next question was directed at you, Clyde, but I understand your points of pyrodiversity, but don't the smaller units go against historically what would have occurred?
Well, so 2 things to think about in that context. One, most fires prehistorically were probably single point ignition sources. And so most fires probably were long and linear, more than, when we set a fire, we set a long, we'll set a margin on a burn block, and then that block will burn across that front, whether it's a head fire or a back end fire, but it'll burn across that front, where if it's a lightning ignited fire, it's going to come from a single source, and it's probably going to spread primarily downwind, which would mean that a lot of those fires may run for miles, but they would be more linear than a lot of our prescribed fire blocks would be. And the other thing to think about is that we've got an ecosystem now that's highly fragmented. And so a lot of what might have been contributing to biodiversity in that prehistoric landscape is now occupied by farm fields or development or interrupted by roads and whatnot. And so I don't think the context is exactly the same. But you're well aware any fire that burns, in say a longleaf system is going to leave a patchwork on its own. And it's just a matter of how many different scales you're trying to achieve in that patchwork. Did that help at all, or is that just muddying the water?
I think that was good, Clyde. Yeah, and I'm going to swing back to some of those other questions, but we had kind of a similar burn block size related question. Would increasing burn block size but encouraging patchy, heterogeneous burns, and variation in frequency be one way to accomplish biodiversity? So I think you were kind of just covering that a bit. But anything extra to add on that?
I think that would be a desirable course to pursue if you have mechanisms to do it. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Might you catch less in bowls when flower capacity is highest?
Indeed, you might. That's an excellent, insightful question, and something that the sort of whole bee research community is fretting about lately, because bee bowls have been a pretty standard sampling method, often in combination with netting, for a few decades now. And we have some ongoing research, and there have been some recent sort of opinion pieces saying, oh, like these actually aren't very good at telling you how many bees of a particular kind are in a landscape. Like they're very good at catching tiny bees that you might miss if you're out netting, but they don't necessarily tell you, like, if the bowls catch more of species A than species B, that the world contains more of species A than species B. And there's some kind of circumstantial evidence that, yeah, they're less efficient when there are a lot of flowers around, because bees have other more attractive things to visit when there's lots of flowers. So yeah, there's a lot of questions around how to interpret bee bowl samples that bee research in general is dealing with right now. So, yep.
Bottom
Right.
line is that any sampling technique that we use is liable to have some sort of a bias one way or the other. Elsa didn't mention it, but in the study that Heather did, she also did some netting. We just didn't incorporate it in that data set because of some of the structure of that data, but I think she got another 30 or 40 additional species netting that she didn't get in the bowls.
Yep.
So.
Great, thanks. We have a few questions on plants. Are you collecting data on which plant species are within your collection plots? Or are you charting bloom periods for comparison with bee species occurrence?
Yeah, I think that we can pull that data together because it's pretty obvious based on all of the data that we're incorporating. So I think that it'll be easy to make those connections. I mean, it's certainly easy when we're out in the field to see where the bloom periods are and what species are. And so what I didn't mention is that in addition to writing down what flower we're catching the bees on, we're also doing vegetation transects, and we're incorporating what species we're finding along a 50 meter transect within the area where we're sampling. So we're trying to catch as much of that vegetation information as we can.
Great, thank you. And has anyone looked at the role of native versus exotic plant species in supporting the native bee communities?
I don't know, in a fire context or in natural areas, I don't know that people have looked into that very much. It's a big deal in I'm sure they have. I just don't know those papers. Clyde and Gabriella should climb in. I know in urban contexts, which is more where I do a lot of work, there's a lot of research looking at that. And it seems like non-native plants, I mean, they're terrible for like Lepidoptera, for caterpillars, because they tend to be host specialists. And so the non-native plants tend to be a bit unusable for them. But for bees, like the pollen and nectar are often pretty usable even from non-native plants. And there are a lot of things like, clovers and some other non-natives that do produce a lot of resources, feed a lot of bumblebees and other generalist bees. There are some specialist bees who demand specific genera or families of plants, and they're less likely to be able to use non-natives, but sometimes they can, even, if it's a closely related non-native to something that's here, like something in the same genus, sometimes they can switch over. So it's kind of a mixed bag. In general, provided it's not invasive, it's better than nothing. But there are some kind of specialized host relationships that would restrict some species' ability to use those.
Great, thank you. And we just have about 2 more questions and then we will wrap up. Can we affect local populations if we live in a subdivision with not many pollinators? Only 15 miles away in the Croatan are many, many species, but not here.
Yeah, those 15 miles could be really hard to cross depending on what's in between them. again, coming from like my usual urban context, there are studies starting to show that even like a highway or a tall building can be barriers to bee foraging movements. So I think depending on what's in between, it could be pretty hard to get a population to expand over that kind of distance. If there's some kind of nice corridor in between, then yeah, adding another subdivision's worth of resources that connects to others will definitely attract and support pollinators. But if it's so isolated, it could be hard.
And I'm thinking too, because in a lot of urban areas, depending on what forage is available, so if you have, some species that are only in bloom for maybe a couple of weeks in June, and then everything else it's barren in the spring and the fall, then you're almost creating a sink for the species that do make it there in the summer. And then you don't have any forage for those other really important times of the year when bees need nectar and pollen. So I think in a lot of urban, suburban areas, we're seeing that lack of floral functionality to sustain pollinators.
Yeah, and I'd add, you can think even broader than just pollinators, but if you can exploit native vegetation as much as possible, you're going to be helping a lot of specialist herbivores, caterpillars of one sort or another, and it may actually encourage bees. And then I'd also get you to think about, we've been talking about the kind of habitats bees like, which are sunny herbaceous habitats, and if you can mimic that in your property with as much native vegetation as you can possibly exploit, even though you may not achieve the diversity you see on Croatan, you're probably going to enhance the diversity on your property.
Thank you. Yeah, we just have one more question. We did have a question come in about patchy burns, but I'll just ask that individual if you'd want to follow up with any of these three folks here. That would be great. We did cover some of that. And Sebastian was asking, how common are rare species in the communities you looked at? And how does this affect post-fire community composition? How rare or uncommonly found bees affected by fire?
It's a great question. I can take a crack at it, and Gabriella, or maybe both of Gabriella and Clyde also have comments. My first reaction is that rare things are really hard to study because they often turn up as like one individual once, and it's not enough to see a pattern of like, oh, this one individual once showed up in a recently burned site, but that doesn't really help you reach conclusions. You would need to have that happen a few times. So there are quite a few bees that we've come across, once or twice in these studies. Some of them are rarely encountered in the state. And it's really hard to tell exactly, like it's the common bees where you can actually see the trends that, their abundance became more or less after a given treatment. And then the other ones just kind of like wink in and out in ways that are hard to predict.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment, Elsa, because, going back to the species, the Tricusa species that we found on sandhills, we found one. So is that a positive thing because we found one? Or is that a negative thing because we didn't find 15? But that's not to say that 15 aren't out there, because we're just looking at diversity. We're not looking at abundance in this study. So it really makes it hard to see some of those trends. And, we don't necessarily want to look at abundance because we don't want to be catching 30 different bumblebees, then that might be depleting the population. So I guess it sort of depends on how you're looking at it.
Yeah, the other problem with answering that question is you have to have some knowledge of the natural history of those species. And sometimes rare bees, we know very little more than where they've occurred. We don't know much about what their habitat requirements are, and why it was that you found that bee there, because they just haven't been studied. And that's one of the problems and one of the wonders of working with insects. They're so insanely diverse that we can't know all we need to know about everybody we need to know when we need to know it.
That makes sense. And we just have one more question to conclude on. Can purchase bees, mason, and leaf cutters actually establish in a suburb?
They can. I think Like, I don't typically recommend purchasing them for a couple of reasons. And it's not like it's a terrible thing to do, but a couple of considerations. Like the leafcutter bees that you can purchase are actually not native. So if you care about that, that's a consideration. They're not necessarily invasive, but they're, you know, not part of the native bee community. So they were brought here for use in agricultural pollination. And the mason bees that you buy, they are native, but there's a couple of different subspecies in the US and you don't really know what you're getting, whether you're getting locally adapted bees or bees from like the Pacific Northwest. So that can also be a little tricky to navigate. And my thinking is that if there are enough resources there for a population to establish, then you'll probably also be able to attract the native ones to the site. So if you put out like nesting resources, like the same resources that you would put out for purchased bees, like a bee hotel, nesting tube kind of things, they have a lot of little native cousins, like other little native mason bees and native leaf cutting bees that can also, you know, move in and start using those nesting spaces. So if there are anywhere nearby, you should be able to attract the natives if everything is there that they need. And if it's not there, then the purchased ones would also, you know, decline over time.
Thank you all so much. I'll turn it back over to you if you want to conclude our chat today. Thank you, Gabriella.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tara,
Jen.
for helping with the Q&A. Yep, I think since we're running quite a bit over, thanks to those who were able to stay on. Like I said, we've recorded this and we'll be sharing it within the next several days. We'll send out an email to let you know when it's available. If you have any other questions that we weren't able to answer, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll do the best we can to help with that question. But again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Everyone have a great day.
Take care.